Well, hello again. This is the 11th of May 2025, and this is, I suppose, indirectly a naughty thoughty. Hopefully, that should become clearer as time goes on. I'll start by saying I have no connection whatsoever, to the trans community. I don't even know any trans people that I'm aware of. To me, they're just some sort of very small, benign minority group that I've got nothing against. I don't see as a threat. Don't understand how they feel or why, but they're doing their thing over there, I'm sure, and that's no problem at all to me. Right. What this is about is I think, very worrying, growing power and influence of the feminism appropriating reactionary transphobe community. If they're not going to respect people's preferred names and pronouns, I'm not going to respect theirs. And what brought this about, why I'm thinking about this, why it's very much on my mind, is that a couple of weeks ago, the Supreme Court made it law that people who are biologically male, which can mean many things to many people, can no longer enter women's toilets, changing rooms, etc. And why is this a worry for me? As someone who is, as far as I'm aware, biologically female, why am I particularly personally concerned by this? I mean, I think it is setting a lot of very worrying precedents to start with. I mean, a trans woman who has a gender recognition certificate is, or at least was, legally female. In the same way as, someone who has adopted a child is legally that child's parent. Someone who is married is legally their partner's next of kin. And so you can't just remove the power of a signed, sealed, approved legal document because it runs contrary to some people's opinions. I mean, if homophobes start saying, right, we don't want gays to be married anymore, we want to rescind all gay marriage certificates, can they do that as well? Now, if racists say we don't want anyone to be a British citizen who wasn't born here, can they just remove citizenship for anyone who wasn't born here? Is that how we do things now? I mean, the whole world, our whole society is run on bits of paper with writing on them. If we decide they are worthless, that we can just remove the power of those things, then where do we stand in terms of, ownership of houses and registration of cars, birth, death and marriage certificates, qualifications? How can just one pressure group decide, have it made law that these gender recognition certificates are just not worth the paper they're written on? How has that happened? Is nobody else bothered by that? No, I find that very concerning. As I cannot believe that has been approved. If some of my neighbours took a dislike to me, could they just get together and say that, I no longer own my house, and have that made law? What? How is that possible? How can you just say that a legal document no longer has any meaning? These things aren't just handed out like sweets. To get the gender recognition certificate, they have to have been living as a woman for, I think it's 2 years. That is, being called a woman's name, being referred to as she, her, wearing female clothes, just in, having everyone call them a woman, and believing themselves to be a woman to the point that they can, go through therapy, go through hormone treatment, even have plastic surgery, convince, is it 2 doctors? Do they have to convince 2 doctors? I'm not sure exactly how it works, but they do have to convince a certain number of doctors that they are genuinely transgender. You don't just say, right, I'm a woman now, and suddenly you get your gender recognition certificate, through the post. It's a long, slow, painful process. If someone's prepared to do all that, I'm perfectly happy for them to go in my toilets. I mean, I'm sure there are racist women who don't want foreign women in their toilets, homophobic women who don't want lesbians in their toilets, but, are they going to be allowed to make laws now as well? How has not just the screaming idiots in comment sections, but the actual Supreme Court come to the conclusion that trans women are no longer welcome in the women's toilets, or indeed changing rooms? What's all that about? And where do trans men come into all this? That's the thing that bothers me as well. Where do the trans men come into? Are they not bothered about trans men? Because, I mean, if we take their sort of assumption that, a trans woman is a man who is so keen to catch a glimpse of your auntie's bum that he'll wander into the women's changing rooms and, sort of dressed up as a woman and sort of sit perving on anybody who happens to be there until someone thinks, why is that weirdo not getting changed? Why are they just sitting staring creepily at people? And because, I mean, that what do they think is actually happening? Do they think that is a common scenario? I mean, maybe it has happened. Maybe there have been men who put on a cunning disguise so they can wander into, the women's toilets, the women's changing rooms, whatever, and I don't know what do they think is going to happen. They'll stare at someone. Because there are already laws against sexual assault that apply to anyone of any gender anywhere. What are they actually worried about? So where was I? Yeah, so if they think that trans women really are just men wearing dresses so that they can wander into the women's changing rooms or toilets whenever they like, and, sort of be around some women in a state of undress, maybe on the other side of a cubicle door or something, but, I don't know, maybe they have some sort of fetish for being on the other side of a cubicle door to a woman without any pants on. if they really think that that's what trans women are doing, where do they think trans men fit into all this? Because I found whenever you find one of them ranting on Facebook, you write a comment saying, yeah, but what do you think trans men are doing while all this is going on? If that's what you think a trans woman is, what do you think a trans man is? And they, 9 times out of 10, suddenly remember they've got much more important things to do than argue with strangers on Facebook. I did have one try to tell me once that trans men don't exist. I had one who suddenly changed her argument to, there's no such thing as trans people. You're either a man or a woman. Trans isn't a word. It's made up. One said, yeah, but men don't mind there being women in their changing rooms. It's just such a confused mess, trying to work out what their problem is and why, and what they think trans women, while they're completely ignoring trans men, what they think trans women are actually up to. I mean, maybe, I'm not going to say it has never happened that a man has put on a dress to go into the woman's changing room and sit staring at women getting changed. But that would have been noticed. Someone would have noticed that this particular changing room user is not getting changed. They are staring pervily at the other changing room users. And they would have been removed. And if they think that some men are doing this, that they're saying they are trans women so that they can get into the women's changing room, why is that trans women's fault? Actual genuine trans women. Why do they want to throw the genuine trans women under the bus because some men, some cisgender men, are causing a problem? What's that all about? I mean, there have been cases. There have been cases of trans women being put in prison with, cisgender women, and they've sexually assaulted someone. Right, that has happened. There have also been cases of cisgender women in prison sexually assaulting their inmates. There have been male prison staff that sexually assault female prisoners. There have been men in men's prisons, cisgender men, assaulting each other. I mean, what do they think they are actually preventing by putting trans women in men's prisons? Because prisons are full, surprisingly, you may be surprised to hear, they're absolutely full of dangerous criminals. They assault each other all the time. It's a fact of prison life that a lot of people there are not very nice, or are very unbalanced, or have terrible mental health issues, and are dangerous to be around. It's where are you going to put a prisoner who is a danger to other prisoners that are not particularly violent or dangerous in any way? How is a trans woman assaulting another inmate different from a cisgender inmate assaulting another inmate? And again, they seem to have this idea that all a man has to do to be locked up in a woman's prison is to say, oh, I'm actually trans. Right, the reason that I'll move on. The reason that I find this, personally worrying is that I don't know who's policing all this. How are we going to decide who is a biological woman that is then allowed into the women's toilets, right? Because I don't trust the members of the public who really care about the chromosomal makeup of the people in the next toilet cubicle, right? I read a story in America the other day. There's a woman who was 6 foot tall, a cisgender woman. She was 6 foot tall. She worked in a supermarket. She went into the toilets. A male shopper saw her go in and decided that person is too tall to be a woman and followed her in. Bear in mind this is a man, right, who's just invited himself into the women's toilets to challenge a cisgender woman who he believes to be trans simply because she is very tall. Like me, right? I am very tall. The very tall woman, of course, argued back, and she lost her job because she was arguing with a customer. Great work protecting the women from dangerous men. Right, if the TERFs can worry that a man is putting on a dress to wander into the women's toilets and be in the vicinity of partially undressed women, right? I can worry that someone's going to come and chuck me out of the toilets because I'm unusually tall. Right? I do know one of my online friends is a woman who has short hair, right? And, she doesn't dress in a particularly feminine way. And she was actually having, transphobic slurs shouted at her once on a bus. It's just that the mental gymnastics that must have gone on in those people's minds. They see someone who is, female, but doesn't look particularly feminine, and they decide that she's trans and start bullying her for being trans. And how does that work? Right? But these are the people who are doing the policing of the trans women in the toilets. Or changing rooms. Or prisons. Or sports pitches. Because, of course, the Football Association has just said no more trans women are allowed to play on women's teams. The women's cricket and netball and athletics teams have also said no more trans women, on their women's teams. It says that, having an XY chromosome puts them at an unfair advantage. And what if they have a chromosomal abnormality? Like the boxer, Imani, what was her name? She didn't even realise she was intersex until she was, actually tested, because people were arguing, she looks trans. Oh, there was that photo of Simone Biles, the athlete Simone Biles. She was sort of clapping her hands, all the dust flying off, and she looked sort of muscular, and she had sort of quite a stern expression on. And suddenly she was getting a load of transphobic abuse, because she was being a elite sportswoman. She was very muscular. These are the people who are policing the trans women in the toilets. I'm tall. I also have a 7-year-old son who I take in the women's toilets with me when we're out without his dad. Right. At what age must he go in the men's? I did ask this to someone who was making a scene once on Facebook about, men in women's toilets. Blah, blah. And he said, well, if he's very small, I suppose it's all right, but if he's 14, I start asking questions. But the thing is, it's not just a, oh, you know yourself kind of thing. This is law now. This is law. I could get prosecuted for taking my son in the women's toilets if he is deemed too old by the toilet police. At what age must he go in the men's? I need an answer. I need a specific age at which my son must go in the men's toilets. Can I just give my word for that, or do I need to take photographic ID? Because he doesn't have any. I've got his birth certificate. Is that enough? Must I take my son's birth certificate out with me whenever I go out without his dad, in case we need to go in the women's toilets and I need to sort of show it to somebody? And also, if my 7-year-old son has to go in the men's toilets on his own, I hope whoever is dealing with this terrible issue is vetting the people who go in the men's toilets as rigorously as they're vetting the people in the women's. Are you CRB checking everyone who goes in the men's toilets? Because, if you're sending little boys in the men's toilets on their own, I want to know that they're safe. I want to know they're as safe as the grown women in the women's toilets. I mean, the obvious answer is individual cubicles. There's a pool near me that a few years ago it had separate male and female changing rooms, but then it just knocked them all through and put in cubicles, just individual cubicles for everyone, and it is so much better for everybody. It's better for dads taking little girls swimming. It's better for Muslim women, people who've got body issues, and people like me who don't have a valid excuse, but given the choice would rather not strip off and show me boobs to any number of strangers. It. And there is a cafe I go to sometimes that's got unisex toilets. You know, each toilet is in its own little cubicle. There's just a row of cubicles with a sink in each, and that's it. You know, just like disabled toilets always have been, except they're, you know, they're smaller than disabled toilets. And it took me a while to be sold on the idea of unisex toilets, actually, but I thought disabled toilets always have been. A lot of, you know, little independent shops and cafes and things, they only have one toilet anyway. At my workplace, we have two cubicles, one's the men's, one's the women's, but, you know, if there's a man in the men's and another man wants a wee, no one's going to shout at him for going in the women's, you know, it's... It works, it works. I mean, it'd be a lot of money and a massive cultural shift to kind of retrofit every public toilet in the country, but for new ones being produced, you know, it works well. Of course, where do intersex people fit into all this? Because if you're legislating about trans women, we need to legislate about intersex people as well. There are people with XY chromosomes who are in every other way female, or people with XXY chromosomes. There are people with all sorts of chromosomal makeups who need to have a wee sometimes when they're out, who want to play sports. Where do they go? I mean, there are plenty of intersex people who've, you know, explained their issues a lot, you know, in a lot more detail than I can. But there's estimates of anything between 1% and 3% of the world's population are to some degree intersex. I mean, have you actually had your chromosomes tested? Do you know what your chromosomal makeup is? Do you know that you don't have, you know, some internal organs of one gender and some of another? You know, I was reading a story the other day about a woman who was 20 before she went to the doctors saying she wasn't menstruating, she'd never menstruated, and she found that she actually didn't have a uterus, but she did have some undescended testicles. You know, she was 20 years old and she didn't have a clue. I mean, there was another story about a man who was in his 70s. He went to have an operation for something else, and the surgeon found he had a uterus. I mean, presumably not a functional one, because he'd have noticed if he was having periods, presumably, or if he got pregnant ever, but apparently had no idea that he had this uterus. You know, we are all biological mix-ups in some way or other. The overwhelming majority of us fit into either innie or outie genitals. And how we feel about that is, you know, entirely our own business. I think the fact that this is even such a big issue, you know, this is the hot topic of the day. You know, you can't even post a picture of your cat and say, oh, this is my 5-year-old girl, without someone saying, oh, you can't say your cat's female anymore, without someone getting offended. You know, this, it has somehow just become top of the news agenda. It's just at the forefront of everybody's minds all the time. It's mystifying how it's become such a big issue so quickly. I mean, can we just blame J.K. Rowling for this? Is it all her fault? I saw her celebrating the Supreme Court's ruling by lighting a cigar in the paper. I thought that doesn't seem very feminine. I think it's a really sad indictment of the state of feminism in the 21st century, actually. I mean, second wave feminism never reached any sort of conclusion. You know, what even is third wave feminism? Don't know. I mean, we're still facing all the same struggles that were pointed out to me when I was a little girl 30 years ago as self-evident truths. You know, that women do the hard work for no recognition, that women's roles in the family are to serve their husband like a slave, raise the children like a slave. You know, women described in the news are always described by how they look and who they're married to, and not who they are themselves. It's God. It's still very much the case that women who have lots of sex are criticised for being slutty, and women who don't want to have sex are criticised for being frigid, and all, and just these basic things that you'd think we could have moved on from by now. And it's just the same things over and over and over again, the same discussions, the same. Look, Margaret Thatcher killed feminism. Changed my mind. The Spice Girls danced on its grave, chanting, "Girl power!" By the time 50 Shades of Grey was being advertised as, finally, a book about what women really want. I mean, that was just feminism being exhumed and ceremoniously tried and executed and gibbeted. It's just such a confused mess these days. You know, you don't want to keep bringing up the same things that people have been arguing about for 50 years, but there's been no progress. I mean, all that's changed are, in my lifetime, that I have noticed, there's a few more female comedians, academics, sports people, general non-decorative objects, getting their occasional share of airtime. Just a few more women on telly, maybe, than there used to be, being interesting stroke serious. I don't know. And women are now equal to men in terms of, heirs to the throne. Now it goes Charles, Charlotte, Louis, not Charles, Louis, Charlotte. Great. So someone once said to me, in a disparaging tone, your politics are still stuck in the 70s. And I said, well, That's because society hasn't changed. We're still discussing all the same problems. They all still exist. Gays can get married now. That's it. That's it. That's all. That's the only major difference, in terms of law, in terms of people's rights. That's really happened in half a century. How does this become an naughty-thoughty? Indirectly, let's say. The main thing that people have, well, that transphobes have against trans people, that transmisogynists have against trans women in particular, isn't that they've caused any issues. They haven't been causing problems. Okay, there have been cases of trans people, committing crimes and so on. They don't do that at any greater rate than the general population. No. Trans people are people. Sometimes people do things wrong. Okay. There's no correlation between being trans and being a sex offender. There is some correlation between being trans and being a victim of sexual violence, being a victim of general violence. But trans people in themselves are no more of a risk than the general population. That's just statistics, right? They weren't banned from taking part in women's sports because they were causing problems in women's sports. They weren't winning all the time. They weren't, doing anything to, upset, offend, intimidate their cisgender teammates as a group. They weren't banned from women's toilets and changing rooms because they are causing problems in there. They were banned from all these places because people think they're a bit weird. They look a bit funny. They're not like us. That's all it is. It's nothing that they, as a group, are doing. It's that transphobes don't like them. Transphobes think they're weird. They make transphobes uncomfortable. That's it. Autistics are a bit weird as well. We sometimes make the allistics feel a bit uncomfortable. We sometimes come across as being a bit standoffish. Sometimes we commit crimes. Not at a greater rate than the general population, but if you want to focus on crimes committed by autistic people. I'm sure you could find a few stories and sort of put together a case if you really wanted to. If you were a massive neurophobe, you could put together a case that autistic people are dangerous. You could find a few autistic people probably that, lash out, that have violent outbursts, and make a big deal of them and portray them as being representative of autistics as a whole. What I'm trying to say is we're next. I mean, the American government has already started registering autistics. It started a list of all the autistic people in America, right? What's that for? I know it's America. America's just off the rails at the moment. America's completely lost the plot at the moment. America would be the laughing stock of the world if it wasn't, actually affecting some real people who didn't vote for, he must not be named. But yeah, that's what's going on in America at the moment. They're making a list of all the autistics. Now, you know how things spread on the misinformation highway? Like the anti-vaxxers and the flat earthers and so on. They started off as, just little groups of crazy guys who somehow managed to infiltrate the minds of the world. How do we even know what, anti-vaxxers and flat earthers are? I mean, some of the conspiracy theorists have got to be in the bonnet about trans people, even, The idea that the blood-sucking, shape-shifting Jewish paedophile lizards from space are also all transgender. And but yeah, they don't like us either, do they? The conspiracy theorists. The blood-sucking, shape-shifting Jewish paedophile transgender space lizards. So want to make everybody autistic by giving us vaccines or something, I don't know. Just rearrange the words into some sort of sentence. That's how it works, isn't it? The conspiracy theorist thing. They just take some words out of a hat and rearrange them into a sentence and then get angry about it. And quite often, autistics and trans people. And of course, there is slightly more of an overlap than in the general population between being autistic and being trans. I think the bottom line is, whatever it is that makes people trans, I don't know what makes people trans. Is it a response to rigidly imposed gender norms? Is it some sort of chromosomal genetic abnormality that makes someone feel one gender and appear the other? Is it a mental illness? It's the thing is, ultimately, whatever it is, they are, in themselves as a group, completely harmless. If they want to be called a different name, if they want to be called different pronouns, whatever, no skin off my nose, I'll call them whatever they like. How hard is it just to be polite to people? Just to treat them as humans? Just let them go in the toilets they want to be in. I will just talk about the sports thing for a minute. There was just something else that I wanted to say about the sports thing. I think what the whole discussion about trans people in sports suggests is that dividing sports into women's and men's is a nonsense. There are so many ways that one person could have advantage over another in sports. You know, so the overwhelming majority of gold medal winners across the board are fit, healthy 20-somethings who are tall and athletic build. You know, it's who've done a lot of training. You know, it's, as I say, the variation between people's gender presentation is so great that, you know, lumping all the women over here and all the men over here is, well, it's unhelpful. You know, it's, why don't we have sections for tall men and short men, or old men and young men, or thin women and fat women? I suppose there's a Paralympics, you know, that's for people with various disabilities. But the idea that there are only two body types, you know, innie genitals or outie genitals, it's ridiculous. I mean, at least in boxing, you know, they separate them by weight. You know, they have the featherweights and the lightweights and the middleweights and so on. So at least, you know, you're not just fighting all the men together and all the women together. You know, you have small men together and big men, and small women and big women. And that would make so much more sense in all other sports as well. You know, a tall person has an advantage over a short person, but we're not banning tall people from sports. No one would ever suggest we ban people above average height from sports because they have an advantage, or that people in their 20s are banned from sports, or that people who've got, you know, particularly good trainers are banned from the sports. No one who hasn't got asthma is banned from sports. You know, because the trans women aren't necessarily winning. You know, the odd times trans women have turned up in professional sports, you know, they haven't automatically won everything. And I think the assumption that they are a threat, they are a danger, it's just another way of denigrating women's sports. Belittling female sports players generally. There's no way they can compete against a man. I mean, are there trans women in sports that win everything? I'm sure if there were, we'd have heard of them. We'd have never stopped hearing about them. We'd be absolutely sick of hearing about them. There have been cases of, women who just happen to have more testosterone than average being banned from sports because, their results came back, they're really men or something. And I think the dangerous thing here as well is scrutinising female athletes for any kind of physical abnormality and then ignoring the same kind of things in men. Because as we know, trans men don't exist. It's just the same story as, the changing rooms and the toilets. We're scrutinising the women and ignoring the men who are actually the ones that are, causing the problem, if indeed there is a problem. If there really are men wandering into women's toilets, women's changing rooms, saying they are trans, that is men causing the problem, not trans women. Trans women are, if these stories are true, trans women are collateral damage. They're the ones suffering because cisgender men have demonised them. This isn't rocket science. And what they've done, what this new law has done, if indeed there were ever men walking into the women's changing room saying, "Oh, I'm actually a trans woman, you can't throw me out, I have every right to be here," they can now walk into the women's changing rooms without a cunning disguise and say, "I'm actually a trans man. I am biologically female. I'm going to sit here on this chair and watch you all get your bums out, and there's nothing you can do about it because I'm biologically female. Ha 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 ha." Of course, you can do something about it. You can go and get security and say, "Oh, there's somebody sat in the women's changing rooms who won't budge, just perving on everyone," and they will be removed and banned, presumably. If people really fear sexual assault, why are they taking it all out on trans women? Why? It's just mystifying. Why are trans women getting so much stick for something that they don't do at a higher rate than anyone else. For something that, you know, is being done in this scenario, which may be entirely fabricated, I don't know. I don't know if it ever has happened. Let's just make that absolutely clear. This may have never happened. I don't know that it ever has. You know, correct me if I'm wrong. This scenario of the man wandering into the women's changing rooms with a dress on, so he can, you know, maybe see a bit of side boob before, you know, your mum gets a bra on. The person at fault there is not a trans woman, it's a man. It's a cisgender man. And what are they? You know, the people who support this legislation, what are they going to do to ensure that men are keeping out of the women's changing? Are they actually going to have guards on the door? Are they suggesting that anywhere that has a toilet needs to have some sort of security guard? You know, someone who is responsible for monitoring the toilets. What do they want to happen? Do we all have to carry some sort of ID around with us, with, you know, the gender we were assigned at birth on it? Do we all have to have our chromosomes tested and have that put on the ID? What if we forget our ID? Whose responsibility is this to check? Oh, is it only women who need ID cards? Is it only ugly women? You know, women with sort of fluffy chins and flat chests who could be mistaken for a man in a dress? Great work, feminists. I feel so safe. Of course, they're not feminists, are they? It's gone beyond caring about women. It's just hating trans women now. That's all they're doing. They're just hating trans women and calling it feminism. Sorry, I just really needed to get that off my chest. It's been an hour. I'll see you in the next one.